Welcome to Defy These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century. It is a project born out of my conviction that doing so requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to understanding our complex world. I'm your host, Joey Ayub, and in these episodes I bring you conversations at the intersection of politics, history, philosophy, culture, science, and all the fun stuff in between. The following episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check the website for other methods. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabeat. Here's the episode. Hey everyone, so this is another special episode with Sumaya and Shireen. Sumaya is the co-editor of the book Palestine: A Socialist Introduction, and Shireen contributed a chapter to that same book. As we were talking, the ceasefire was announced between Hamas and Israel, which means that by the time that you're probably going to listen to this, a ceasefire would have been established, hopefully, lasting for as long as possible. We discussed a number of things. I won't spend too much time summarizing. We first started discussing our relationship to Palestine, the three of us. We of course contextualized a bit of the recent waves of violence, but we ended up just having kind of a general conversation, mixing the political and the personal, as I sometimes like to do on this podcast, discussing the importance of intersectionality, linking up with Black Lives Matter and the anti-colonial struggles of indigenous peoples around the world, linking up to the struggles of the Arab Spring, the Syrian Revolution, the Bahraini Revolution, the Egyptian Revolution. We mostly focus on the Syrian one, and various other topics that, as I said, I won't get into too much now. So yeah, that's it for me. I won't say too much. Enjoy this episode. I hope you find it informative, and take care, everyone. Thank you both for agreeing to do this on such short notice. I know we had an episode planned to talk about your book, Palestine: A Socialist Introduction. Feel free to reference it as well as much as you want. But I wanted us to have this kind of a reaction episode in some ways, as I think there's some value in also simply talking without necessarily being more prepared, if that makes sense. So, okay, let's just start with some basic introductions, if that's okay. Sumaya, maybe you can start.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. So my name is Sumaya Awad, and I am Palestinian. I was actually born and raised in Jordan. My grandfather's from Jerusalem, and in 1948, his family was forced out, and they went to Beirut because he had an uncle there. And they left thinking they would return, as many, if not most, Palestinians did. But he never was able to return. He passed away in 2019 without being able to home. Although his family home is still in Jerusalem. It's in the old city of Jerusalem. And so I, grew up with Palestine being very central to who I am, my upbringing, and my grandfather was very, very political. And yeah, that's the short of it. Right now, I'm based in New York City. As Joey mentioned, I'm the co-editor of a book that was released in December 2020, Palestine: A Socialist Introduction. You should get a copy if you don't have one. And I'm the director of strategy at the Adala Justice Project, which is a US-based advocacy and organizing organization.
Thanks, Joey and Sumaya. My name is Shireen Akram-Boshar. I'm a Boston-based activist and socialist and a longtime Palestine solidarity activist. While I'm not Palestinian, I also grew up in a very pro-Palestine and anti-imperialist household. My parents were very active on Palestine, although they're Lebanese American and Pakistani. So I actually spent time in Palestine as a child and in East Jerusalem for a summer when I was about 5, and then for a year when I was in first grade. And I think, living there as a child completely shaped my politics, going forward. Since, I remember at 5 years old seeing people get shot in El Khalil and Hebron and at checkpoints, and then I had to go through a checkpoint every day to go to school in first grade, which was very stressful for me as a child. And, I remember my dad, who's Lebanese American, when he tried to visit us one time, he was interrogated for 7 hours when he was trying to get through Israel, basically. And at the same time, I was like completely embraced by the Palestinian community around us and that we lived with at the time. Yeah.
All right, thank you both for this. Also, maybe for the sake of having this episode being self-containing, I will say that, I'm from Lebanon. My grandfather was from Haifa. He passed away last year, and he, like Sumaya's grandfather, also was someone who thought the exile would be temporary. What ended up happening is that in the late 40s, right after the Nakba, he made his way to Zahle in Lebanon, in the Bekaa. And then for one reason or another, which we're not entirely sure why yet, he then migrated more west with my grandmother, who they both met in Palestine. She's Italian, and grew up then spent all of their life, the remaining part of their lives, in Mount Lebanon, where I grew up. And for me, the Palestinian cause was both something that, because I didn't actually know my grandfather's heritage up until about a decade ago, more or less. So the Palestinian cause is something that I learned independently, let's put it that way. And then I discovered that I had an actual direct connection to, which created all sorts of mixed feelings and obviously contradictions in a number of things that maybe we'll get into. But yeah, so I just wanted to put that as well. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about your relationship to Palestine. You sort of already did. I'm kind of, this is going to be a difficult question off the start already, but given that we're recording this specifically on May 20th, 2021, obviously, and things are still very much developing on the ground. What are some of your thoughts on what's been happening, especially recently?
I can start. So, like you said, things are just unfolding by the minute. So I think what triggered what we've seen unfold in the last few weeks and what is still unfolding was the protests in Sheikh Jarrah. Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah, this very small neighborhood in Jerusalem, in occupied Jerusalem, protesting the ethnic cleansing campaign that Israel's armed forces and settler organizations, many of them who have headquarters here in the United States, some in New York, where I am right now, trying to force the Palestinian families out and to give their homes to these settlers. And there's been so many videos circulating of the violence and the dehumanization that these settlers represent, and how many of them have American accents, right? Like they're very new to this land, and yet they're taking over the homes of Palestinians that have been there for centuries. And so in Sheikh Jarrah, the protest against the Judaization of Jerusalem ended up triggering much larger protests in Jerusalem at Al-Aqsa. And this was all happening in the last 10 days of Ramadan, which is already a very important, and in years past also there have always been protests in those last 10 days because Israeli forces prevent Palestinians from going to Al-Aqsa to pray and to worship. And so the Sheikh Jarrah protests made international news. One, I think important to point out because of the brutality of the Israeli police against these unarmed, just Palestinians in their neighborhood, at their homes. We saw photos and videos of settlers forcing themselves into these homes, throwing grenades, having these like AR-51s strapped onto their backs, just walking around these streets, harassing and assaulting Palestinians. And I think that there's definitely, and maybe we can talk about this later, but there's definitely a connection between seeing that and the police brutality in Sheikh Jarrah and connecting it to the police brutality and the protests we saw here just last summer. But then that spread into the Al-Aqsa protests, and Israeli forces themselves into Al-Aqsa mosque while people were praying at night, opened fire on them, live ammunition was used, grenades. And I think all of this sparked a much larger awakening in Palestine, and importantly, not just in Jerusalem and not just in the West Bank, but also Palestinians living in 48 who rose up as well and protested in solidarity and against what they've been facing, both police brutality, the occupation of their land, and of course the connection to Gaza. And that's when Gaza, Hamas intervened, and it was sort of this resistance that was from the river to the sea, as we've always chanted for decades, but it was happening right before our eyes. Palestinians from Gaza, from 48, from the West Bank, from Jerusalem, were all rising together against the colonization of their lands, and with one common goal, and this occupation and this settler colonial project. And then I think another really important thing to point out is how that spilled over to the diaspora, right? To Jordan, to Lebanon, to Syria, and then beyond that. So you had Jordanians first protesting at the Israeli embassy, which isn't new. This happens almost every Ramadan when Israeli forces attack Al-Aqsa. But what was different is, hundreds, if not thousands, of Jordanians that went to the border with Palestine, the infamous Allenby Bridge border, and protested there. And we're chanting, open the borders to these rows of armed Jordanian military officers. And some of them actually managed to push their way through, although very quickly were forced back. And in Lebanon as well, although there, one of the protesters was shot and killed. And I think that showing this, there's these protests of return. I mean, all of these are Palestinians, right? That Jordan's population is majority Palestinians that were forced out in 1948 or earlier or after, wanting to return home and to defend their land. And many have pointed out on Twitter and elsewhere that the last time there was this show of unification was in 1947, where you had Palestinians across the board together as a unified whole, fighting to get their land back. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Sumaya. You've really laid everything out there. I guess I'll just comment a little bit on a few things that have been taking place. I mean, I think it's really such a different moment right now because, on the one hand, you're seeing the massive, completely unleashed violence of the colonizer, where the Israeli police and the government and military and armed settlers and so on are all working together to escalate, the ethnic cleansing project. And they're carrying out lynchings of Palestinians in cities like Haifa and Lid, and, carrying out the worst bombardment of Gaza that's ever been seen before. So on the one hand, it's a horrifying and absolutely terrifying moment. Not only did Israel bomb the press building in Gaza that was housing Al Jazeera and AP Press and others, they also bombed Gaza's largest bookstore. They bombed the homes of 3 of Gaza's most prominent doctors and the road to Gaza's main hospital. And obviously we can't forget that it's during the COVID pandemic, which has also, pre-existing medical apartheid. And then in East Jerusalem, as Sumaya talked about, of course, weeks before this, the Israeli state, along with settlers, were ramping up their ethnic cleansing project to expel families from Sheikh Jarrah. And at the same time, Jewish Israeli mobs were searching for Palestinians in East Jerusalem to attack or lynch them. And that's escalated to the point where in cities across Israel, Palestinian stores have been attacked or even Palestinian homes broken in on. And to the point where Palestinians in these areas are trying to create, self-defense committees. But on the other hand, we're seeing, again, as Sumaya talked about, unprecedented resistance by Palestinians across the West Bank and East Jerusalem and inside Israel, or what's called 48, in a way that's much more united and is breaking through Israel's fragmentation of the Palestinian people. So inside Israel, or 48, the best example might be Lid, the city of Lid, which still has a large Palestinian population. And the uprising there reached the level of insurrection where the military came in to crush, what they saw as Palestinian uprising and takeover of the city. And, across the West Bank, when Israel started incessantly bombing Gaza, mass protests, people were protesting at 3 a.m. in cities across the West Bank as Israel bombed Gaza, which was very moving to watch. And then there was the call for the general strike this past Tuesday, which seems like it was extremely successful. And Palestinian laborers in Israel, whether they're migrant workers from the West Bank or citizens of Israel, they in very large part didn't show up to work, and that especially affected, certain sectors like construction, which is 50% Palestinian workers, etc. So as Sumaya said, overall, this is a level of unity across fragmented Palestine that we haven't seen in decades. Some people are saying not since the 1936 to 39 Arab Revolt, Great Arab Revolt it was called, but certainly not since like the first and second intifadas of the late 80s and 90s. But I also think I've been studying the first intifada a bit. The demand has actually changed now from my vantage point, at least. So even though the first intifada was a momentous uprising and that with the 36 to 39 revolt, perhaps the peak of Palestinian struggle, at the same time, the first intifada, it was, its main drawback, I'd say, was the mini-state concession. So the PLO really had conceded from its start that there would be a two-state solution. So, and back then the demand was really an end to the occupation. And now I don't see that as the main demand. Instead, it's a demand to end the entire ethnic cleansing project, end colonization, and for full liberation. And I think that's why the addition of folks in 48 or Israel is so much more powerful, because you can't just call for the end of the occupation. It's so much more than that. Can I comment on what Sumaya was saying about the border protests? I don't want to go.
Of course.
Yeah, I think it was particularly moving for me and for many, many others to see the mass protests in Jordan that broke through and crossed the border into Palestine on Nakba Day, which was the 15th. And tens of protesters did the same in Lebanon. As Sumaya said, this symbolizes the desire to return, the right of return for Palestinian refugees across the region and globally. But it also symbolizes that, an uprising is happening and that people are moved by the prospects of decolonization and liberation. And I think it's important to note that the last time this happened was 10 years ago, also on Nakba Day, and it was during the start of the Arab Spring, or Middle East, North Africa revolutions, as they're called, which was a moment of regional uprising where there was, the potential for regional decolonization and liberation. So just from that, the fact that this hasn't happened in 10 years, those border crossing protests, just from that, we're witnessing something historic, and that it is, in fact, an uprising. And I think it's also a reminder of how closely tied Palestine is to the region as a whole, how the impulse for Palestinian liberation is tied to broader struggles and the broader desire for freedom from tyranny and oppression and imperialism. And we could also talk more about that. I mean, I think it's important to note that while there were protests in countries across the region in the world, there actually weren't protests in Egypt, in Cairo, for example, or inside Syria's regime-controlled territory. And that's not because the people there don't have an affinity towards Palestine, but it's because protest and solidarity with Palestine represents such a threat to those counter-revolutionary regimes. Yeah,
or even in Bahrain also, that would be another place where you would have protests otherwise. I would say, yesterday, I think there was protesters in Haifa, I think, were chanting the Hela Hela Ho song that Lebanese people chanted about a year and a half ago, which was really funny for me to see. But it really shows that there is these, cross-border or even anti-border, I would say, exchanges that are happening at that level. Yeah, I took a few notes down, just very briefly, Sumaya, you mentioned the Judaization projects, and I wanted to also emphasize that it's not just a term that we are using. This is a term that, the actual NGOs that we're referencing, that's a term that they have themselves used. Which I think surprises a lot of people when we actually, I will literally just find the links of their own, the description of their own websites. That's a term that they themselves use, which really shows how comfortable they've been in terms of thinking that, there'll be total immunity at this kind of settler colonial project, especially the most brazen version of it. Another thing, both of you mentioned this, and so I think we can get into this a bit more, just this, this more intersectional approach that I think the three of us obviously would adopt, and many people are definitely adopting as well, of on the on the American side, for example, linking up to Black Lives Matter, to the decolonial projects or the decolonization efforts by a lot of indigenous folks, et cetera, And then Shireen, you also mentioned how like in the Middle East and North Africa, like the entire region, how it's also linked to a lot of the struggles that have for the most part been crushed in the past decade, and what that actually means. So yeah, can we get a bit more into this? I don't know who wants to start on this.
Yeah, as Sumaya was saying, I think it can't be ignored that last summer was a summer of Black Lives Matter uprising that, took a hold of the US, but also took on global dimensions and changed the conversation globally about the connections between colonialism and racial oppression today. There was the taking down of statues in the UK, in the US, et cetera, et cetera. And now we're seeing mass protests globally in support of Palestine, and a changed conversation in the US about Palestine. So there's a new way of looking at colonialism and oppression that's becoming more widespread and agreed upon, I guess.
I just want to take us back to the strike for a second, because I actually think it's reported that millions participated in the strike, which is historic, and that's an understatement. Millions across all of occupied Palestine. And more than that, that it was called by youth. It wasn't called by any particular faction or political party. It was actually called from the ground, and that's who led it across the board. And in fact, there was a very conscious understanding that this is not linked to any of the so-called Palestinian leaders and the parties that they represent. And even in Sheikh Jarrah, I think, in Sheikh Jarrah it was like 2 weeks ago when things were starting to hit the international news, when a representative of the PA was going to come visit, and the Sheikh Jarrah community released a statement saying, we don't want anyone that works with and collaborates Israeli security to represent us to come here. And I think that is just so important, because it also right away it ensures that any attempt at negotiations, and I'm using scare quotes, will not be taken seriously, because who are you going to negotiate with? It's either the Palestinian people on the ground or no one, is the message that sent. And also that all of this was unfolding in the lead up to the Nakba. I mean, Shireen, you mentioned Nakba. I think that's just so important, because it's saying it's been 73 years of Israel trying to erase Palestinians. Like, that is the project, erase Palestinians. It's not integrate them and assimilate them, it's erase them.
Right.
And yet Palestinians are persisting. And in fact, are insisting that we're all Palestinians from the river to the sea and in the diaspora. And the strike manifesto that was put out, the statement, it actually really emphasized that the Palestinians in the diaspora are just as Palestinian as Palestinians in occupied Palestine, which I also think is really important. What was your question, Joey? I forgot.
Intersectionality of the struggles, I think.
Yeah. I mean, you've been answering it anyway. I will mention, just to take us a bit forward. It happened, in 2014. Of course, there were the Ferguson protests that were happening at the same time as the war in Gaza, and that definitely led a lot of Palestinians and African American activists and just allies all around to link these things up in a more concrete ways. And I remember this Mariam Barghouti, a good friend of mine, like she was sharing tactics, of what to do on the streets, and other people were doing the same thing.
Right.
And all of these things. And I will mention, there's a book that I contributed to called Social Justice and Israel-Palestine, and one of the chapters was specifically on the link between Black Lives Matter and the Palestinian protests from a few years ago. And this is definitely something now we saw Black Lives Matter releasing statements, of course Angela Davis and a number of other people, and it just become this more of a conscious thing. And as it happened, of course the Black Lives Matter last summer, and just these links are being made more organically, which I definitely think are more interesting. So yeah, I mean that was the question, and you already started answering it. So if you want to continue, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking pretty much the same thing recently, seeing people on Facebook, my medium of choice, like Sean King, who has a massive following, posting about Palestine and how Israel's committing genocide, which I mean, I thought was it's indicative of the changing conversation. But also, I remembered Sean King speaking at Boston University, I would say around 2015, at a packed panel on Black Lives Matter in Palestine, like the connections between Black and Palestinian liberation. So yeah, I was thinking efforts like this made a huge difference in where we are today in the conversation in the US. There were trips that brought Black activists to Palestine. And I know of Palestinian students and activists who were brought to Ferguson during its rebellion around 2014 and 2015. You've mentioned how Syria solidarity activists have been, thinking about these, how the Palestine solidarity movement has made such momentum and movement. And yeah, I think other movements should look to this, decades-long effort by Palestinians and, other activists in the US that have finally brought us to this point. Since I've done some serious solidarity work in depth as well, I've sometimes come across like a sort of impatience, which of course is justified in the sense that, when it comes to Syria, there's been a massive catastrophe and genocide largely ignored. But there's an impatience in terms of activism in the US, like, why aren't folks on board? But it takes, as we see from the Palestinian effort, it takes years of making these connections.
Yeah.
And there's really no alternative to that. We're pushing back on so many dominant narratives, whether it's like Islamophobia, racism, bad ideas about imperialism, isolation and lack of historical knowledge, and a lot of bad ideas on the left. Even when it comes to Palestine, there are a lot of bad ideas on the left that we have to fight through. It sometimes feels like, we have no time. There's these catastrophes happening now, and we need to act. But at the same time, the struggle for liberation is going to take a long time, and building those connections and building the movements, and that's what's going to eventually bring our liberation. There are no shortcuts, basically.
Yeah, for sure. Sumaya?
Yeah, I mean, you both mentioned the connection to Black Lives Matter and Ferguson, which I think is very powerful. And the statement that Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives, released, I believe, at the end of 2016, where it called Israel's project a genocide, I think was a big breaking point. And it was a whole platform that they released, and Palestine was one small part of it. And yet that small part made front page news across the board. And they just released another statement in solidarity with Palestine and drawing on the connections that I think is very important and powerful, because of the very direct relationship, right? The fact that police in this country are trained there, especially in the big metropolises like New York City and Los Angeles and Chicago, and they use the same type of weapons and military tactics, etc. But more than that, because when you saw the images coming out of Sheikh Jarrah, when you see the way the soldiers and the police were beating up Palestinians, young, old, men, women, doesn't matter, in the street, I mean, you can't not think of Ferguson. You can't not think of Minneapolis, Standing Rock, and the list goes on. So I think that was really important. I think also the fact that COVID in the last year, coupled with the last decade of austerity in the US and elsewhere, has made people really fed up with the government and really untrusting of what they say, and the same lines that they keep repeating to sort of just quell people and squash dissent, etc. That makes people think more like, oh, okay, I see this happening. The justifications that are constantly given to me no longer really hold water, right? The idea that Palestinians are the aggressors and instigators, the idea that the whole terrorism charge. I mean, even with Hamas right now, when people are like, okay, well, what about Hamas? What about Hamas? I actually think that's losing water too. I don't think if 3 years ago, right now, what is happening, you wouldn't have as much of an outcry when Hamas started shooting rockets. I mean, what was just introduced to Congress yesterday in the House, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, and Mark Pocan, the resolution they introduced to stop this arms sale, this latest arms sale to Israel, $735 million. That happened right after the assault on Gaza. And I think that's really, really important, and that is indicative of a much larger shift. I think COVID and the way that the government has dealt with COVID and just the disaster that unfolded in the last year in the US and that is unfolding elsewhere in the world right now is also another reason why people are a lot more are instinctually siding with Palestinians. and choosing to uplift that. And maybe this is different, but I think all of this, or maybe you're going to ask this in a bit, Joey, but I think all of this is part of the shift that we're seeing in the US, elsewhere, but in the US in particular, where often the Zionist narrative is strongest and is so powerful on a number of levels.
No, for sure. I wanted to ask a question about the shift of narratives, and we'll focus on the US since you're both based there. In Europe, it's definitely been much slower, and I think like we're seeing some stuff in the UK, we're seeing some stuff in France, but like it's kind of a mixed bag, and you know, maybe I'll do some episode on that more specifically at some point. I would briefly say though, like on the matter of like the exchanges that, or the fact that governments are actually learning from one another as well. Like you mentioned the example of like American and Israeli cops basically exchanging information, actually, you know, training one another and that sort of thing. But there's also like many other things that often not really talked about as much. Like I just wrote actually some of them down that I just, you know, remembered off the spot of like the UAE uses Israeli intelligence software, for example, to spy on its own citizens. Ahmed Mansour was a famous case a couple of years ago, and he's still in prison now. Russia uses Israeli drones in Syria. China has, the Chinese government has used Israeli police tactics in their quote-unquote fight against terrorism, literally using like the Israelis' lessons of how to repress Palestinians and how to do so the same with the Uyghurs. Just a number of other things that I'm sure I'm forgetting. Some other stuff are like more obvious stuff, like, you know, Israel and France, you know, buying weapons, or Egypt with the Israeli government, or Turkey with the Israeli government for that matter as well. You know, all of these things. And so part of what I'm trying to do, or like what other people also are trying to do, is just point these out more consciously, especially when these governments are then trying to use Palestine to whitewash what they themselves try to do within their own territories, or even abroad, like in the case of Russia. Because it has led to a lot of these, you know, Shireen, you referenced this, a lot of these bitterness in activist circles that I really think we need to be very conscious of and very careful with, because it ends up being a, how do you say this?
Holding us back, at least.
Yeah, definitely holding us back, and like comparing sufferings, and that's something that I really think is should be avoided, and we need to be very conscious that people will end up doing this if we don't, you know, we're not very careful with this. At least that's something I focus on. I don't necessarily think everyone should focus on this. But yeah, I mean, to go back to the shift of narratives, it is, I think, like it's valuable to kind of dwell on this a bit more, if that's okay. Like just the fact that. So just a bit of context, I wrote my dissertation in 2016, which was on the politics of Yiddish and Hebrew within like broadly defined like Zionist discourse, or even anti-Zionist discourse in some cases. And at the time, of course, the elections were happening in the US, and it just so happened that, I mean, pretty much the only major Jewish candidate, Bernie Sanders, was also the only one who didn't go to AIPAC. And I remember this being a massive, massive thing at the time, like just something that everyone was talking about and everything. And of course, like, I mean, you know, lots of critiques towards Bernie as well, but this is something that was definitely significant. And since then, we just saw, you know, from Jewish Voice for Peace to If Not Now to other groups that I'm definitely not remembering right now, and this more conscious rejection of the Israeli state's attempt to essentially say that it is the state of all Jews, and just having like this conscious, I mean, just that, I'm kind of repeating myself, and how this actually intersected at the same time with the, you know, Ferguson protests first, and then with Black Lives Matter more broadly, and how this ended up being like, I'm hearing a lot of statements by like Jewish Americans referencing Black Lives Matter in condemning the Israeli government's actions. And I think that's really, really powerful. So can we dwell on this a bit more? Like what can you tell us from your sides of what you've been saying?
I can start. I mean, I think one of the things you alluded to this, Joey, right now is there's a break with Zionism. There's a major break with Zionism that's unfolding in the United States, and just growing and growing. And I think that's massive, because right away, what that does is it undercuts the argument that standing in solidarity with Palestinians, that supporting Palestinian rights, that demanding an end to occupation, to settler colonialism means you're anti-Semitic. It destroys that argument completely. And more groups have adopted anti-Zionism. So Jewish Voice for Peace in 2017 officially adopted it. Other large groups are right now in conversation about coming out publicly against Zionism. But I think that's really important, because it also means that when elected officials, when celebrities, when Other political figures with a lot of following want to speak out in solidarity. They know that they can fall back on the fact that actually it's not all Jewish people that are Zionists. Actually, in fact, many are saying they're anti-Zionist, that Israel doesn't get to speak on behalf of all Jewish people. So I think that's one of the biggest shifts in the US in the Jewish community. I think another is the ability to draw these organic connections between Palestine and a number of other social justice struggles in the US that have been growing, from immigration to anti-war to Black Lives Matter, and the list goes on. Climate crisis, for example, climate justice work, has also made Palestine increasingly in the mainstream and less of a fringe issue, because it's tied with all of these. And of course, this has everything to do with decades and decades of Palestine activists insisting on this work, despite facing deportations, despite facing, losing their jobs, etc. I think another shift that we're seeing, or a result of this, is what's happening in Congress, right? These are the places where Palestinians are heard least, if at all. And yet, what we saw last Thursday was multiple members of Congress on the floor, meaning everything they say is put into the congressional record, speaking up for Palestine, and not like hollow slogans about Palestinian rights, but actually much further than that, right? Like Rashida Tlaib talking about her family under occupation, Ayanna Pressley talking about, what are our values if we're funding this? Sure, some of it has the same liberal rhetoric that we're used to, but the fact that it's happening now, and the messaging that's used, I think, is really different. The fact that we're using words like ethnic cleansing and apartheid. We're not just talking about occupation or rights, but really naming exactly what is happening. And to be honest, I think one of the most powerful speeches from the one in Congress was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's, because it directly connects what's happening in Palestine to U.S. imperialism. And I think that's one of the arguments we have really been trying to push in the Palestine rights movement. And actually, if I have time, can I read it? Can I read an excerpt of it? Because I think it's really powerful. And again, this is not to say that, there's no criticisms that we have of all these people, but it's in this context that the power of these words, I think, is really important. So here's what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said. She said, "My family comes from the island of Puerto Rico, and I grew up visiting my family on the island, where the United States bombed its own territories. And I would go to sleep as a little girl to the sound of US bombs detonating. Practice is what it was called at the time. Practice. And when I saw those airstrikes that are supported with US funds," she means in Gaza, "I could not help but wonder if our communities were practiced for this. This is our business because we are playing a role in it," end quote. I think it's powerful, one, because it connects to US imperialism directly. It's saying what the US is doing in Puerto Rico and is still doing this in Puerto Rico was this practice for what's happening in Gaza. And the second is because it responds to all of the arguments that why should we care about what's happening in Palestine, right? Oftentimes that's what we hear. What do we have to do with it? Why don't we care about what's happening in the US? And it's like, no, actually, this is our business because we're funding it, because we're allowing it to happen with our material support. And the whole material support argument, I also think, is important, because what the US has done for decades is used this idea of material support for terrorism to imprison and to surveil and to deport so many Muslims and Arabs in the United States. Under the guise of material support for terrorism. So the Holy Land Five are a good example, right? These 5 people that were raising money for backpacks and school supplies for people in Gaza, and who were thrown in jail, and 2 of them are serving 65 years in jail until now. They are still in prison. Meanwhile, the US gives Israel $3.8 billion a year that we know goes to buying the weapons that are now, and the bombs that are now falling on Palestinians in Gaza and killing them. And there's no talk about how that's support for the settler colonial regime. So I think there's definitely shifts. The resolution that was introduced and that Bernie Sanders actually just signed on to as well, is bringing to the Senate floor today, calls for halting this latest shipment of weapons or weapons sales. Congress has 10 business days to vote on this. So I think the next 10 days are really critical in figuring out how do we pressure the Senate to not let this deal go through. Not because our liberation is, bound up or wound up with what the Senate does. No, it's a lot more than that. But if this doesn't go through, that's a major signal to Israel that it actually can't act with impunity, that there are consequences, that we're at a moment where we can hold Israel accountable. The potential for that right now is huge. And it's just a matter of how do we seize this opportunity and continue to build momentum and not let it die down.
Yeah. I think this goes well into what's the role of the left in the current moment. So I think, last week Biden called Netanyahu and then said that he's in total support of Israel. And this week he said, he called Israel and said, hey, maybe tone it down a little. I mean, paraphrasing there. But basically what's going on in Congress, et cetera, is a reflection of our movements on the street. And what we need to do to pressure them, I think, is, keep the hundreds of thousands. Apparently there were 250,000 people marching in Michigan, in Detroit a few days ago. So our job is to keep the pressure going in the streets. I actually have several things to say about the role of the left right now. I think, the changing conversation on Palestine might actually be able to push much larger segment of the population, at least in the US, to the left in terms of the relationship with Biden, because, Biden was seen as this alternative to Trump, as almost our saving grace in a certain sense. But now we've seen, he's been in Michigan, and there were about 1,000 people protesting against him in Michigan because of his inability to do anything, because of him giving an arms sale of, or trying to give an arms sale of $735 million worth to Israel while they're bombing Gaza. So this is a chance to actually push back against him, which I think is huge and necessary. In terms of what you were saying earlier about the interconnection, whether it's the police, there's also G4S, HP, these corporations that profit off of the prison system in the US and Israel, et cetera, or the shared technology between the US-Mexico border. But all of that points, what Sumaya was talking about, the role of Israel, or the connection between Israel and imperialism, and the role of Israel globally as like what my chapter in the book was about, Israel as the watchdog for US imperialism. And it has been that way since its inception, pretty much. When the US couldn't openly sell weapons to reactionary regimes in Latin America or globally, really, they had Israel do that. So I think that's also one of the big roles for socialists right now is making that connection to imperialism. Yeah, and the call for BDS is already being put forward, but we have to make the demand that not just, Bernie has said things like reassess US aid to Israel or put, I'm forgetting my terminology, but we need to demand a total end to it. Let's see.
You mean like not just conditioned aid, but like completely just cut it off?
Yes, not conditioned. That's the term. But I also think we have to put forward as socialists that we need mass movements here to end this US-Israel relationship. AOC, what she's doing, it is unprecedented. It is the first time this is happening, but that might start, the sale of $735 million sale of weapons, but that's not enough to end the US-Israel relationship, which is steeped in imperialism, as Sumaya said. And so a change to that requires, a change to the US also as an imperial superpower, which would need a mass uprising here, if not an end to the Democratic Party and the two-party system as a whole. And I think, that might sound far-fetched, but we see it's not entirely impossible. We had a mass uprising across the US last summer, and now we're having, if it continues, this is a movement that's taking shape right now. In addition to that, I think, we also have to push, in terms of what we're pushing for on the left or as Palestine solidarity activists, we have to push for a revival of BDS in many ways, and a revival of our movements. I think they really actually took a hit during the Trump presidency. For example, a lot of Students for Justice in Palestine chapters sort of went underground because of the level of repression. And there were, anti-BDS laws being put forward, et cetera. So for example, but it's really possible to put forward BDS right now in the current moment while the conversation is changing. So for example, in Boston, we have a chapter, it's one of its kind, it's BDS Boston. And for 3 years, the group fought for Cambridge City Council to put forward a resolution to cut ties with Hewlett Packard because they provide technology for the Israeli military. And that came under horrific backlash in around 2018 or 19. But in the past week, a DSA council person actually brought the resolution back. So it's back on the table because of Israel's latest bombardment of Gaza and because of the conversation changing right now and the attention on Israel's crimes right now. So we have to see what will happen with this particular resolution, but I think it shows that, there's an opening to actual on the ground efforts to put BDS into practice. But you might be surprised to know that BDS Boston is one of the only BDS campaigns or chapters in the entire US. So there's massive, support for it, but conversation alone basically is what I'm trying to say. Conversation alone is not enough. The BDS movement in the US is actually much weaker than in Europe or other parts of the world in terms of actual divestment and cutting ties. I could say more. As socialists, we also have to make, the argument we make in the book that Sumaya co-edited and I contributed to is the understanding of Palestinian liberation as, tied to the regional liberation, tied to an understanding of imperialism as, not just US imperialism, but the way that the current stage of imperialism globally, I guess you would say. I don't know if you want to talk more about the left. It's interesting being at protests right now because, being in the DSA, but for example, in Boston, we're managing to bring more and more DSA folks out to these protests. So
DSA is the Democratic Socialists of America, for those who don't know.
Yes. And it's sort of an effort to reorient DSA because DSA can often be focused on the electoral aspect or who are we going to get into office that's a socialist. But now we're saying, we need people on the street to show that we support Palestine and to be part of this movement. So that's an argument we're making. And at the same time, you see other socialist groups like I was very frustrated seeing groups like Socialist Alternative, who have the analysis that we push back against in the book with a chapter about the Israeli working class. But they still think, Israel's working class is a potentially progressive force, which I think completely overlooks what's happening on the ground. And because of this, they're against BDS. So there's a lot of work. We see overall the left being so in support of Palestine, but there's actually a lot of work to be done still, of course. And then there are other groups like PSL, which sees US imperialism as the major imperialist force and is against the Syrian revolution, et cetera. And that's where, again, we need socialists who are saying, actually, we need an end to the regimes across the Middle East that are colluding with Israel in one way or another, or preventing their people from rising up in solidarity with Palestine. And that needs to be part of the analysis. I've definitely gone on too long.
That's fine. Thanks for that. Maya?
Yeah. I'll pick up where Shireen left off. I think that we need to definitely connect Palestine to all of these other anti-imperialist struggles in the region and beyond. And I think Palestinians on the ground have actually been doing that online and when speaking to the media, connecting Palestine to Syria, to Western Sahara, to Yemen, to Afghanistan, which is really key and really important because it also forces all of those not in Palestine to reckon with the fact that this is what Palestinians are saying. They are making those connections. They're saying it's not just us. And they're de-exceptionalizing what's happening. There's nothing new about what Israel is doing. It's something that's been done again and again and again. I think another thing is that Jihad Abu Salim, who's Palestinian from Gaza, currently based in the US, also pointed out to me, we were talking the other day, how during the protests at Al-Aqsa last week, there were Syrian revolution flags flying. People were making the connection between Palestine and Syria. Mm-hmm. So this is not new. This is not something being imposed. This is something organic that people are calling for. I think that, before talking about what we need to do, I want to preface it by saying that in the US, the attacks on the Palestine movement, on Palestine solidarity, are very vicious, more so than in other places. They not only exist on the ground, so like in campuses and within organizations and communities, but they actually exist on the federal level. So there are over 200 laws right now attempting to criminalize Palestine advocacy. 23% of them have passed. And there's new laws that are expected to be introduced this year that would actually, in some states, would have any sort of criticism of Israel and Zionism be considered not just hate speech, but potentially a hate crime. And that's a federal offense. And this is just a simple statement like Israel is an apartheid state could be considered a hate crime. And there's no reason to think that these are just going to disappear because the movement is growing. Because what we're seeing is that, sure, the movement is growing. There's more people, more and more celebrities and elected officials are speaking out publicly. But U.S. policy remains the same. It hasn't wavered yet. Whether or not this resolution to stop this arms sales goes through, that might be one of the first times that we're actually able to influence policy in that way. And of course, there's social media censorship. So I'm sure everyone's heard about this already, but in the last 3 weeks alone, this has been happening for years, but in the last 3 weeks, the amount of censorship on Facebook and on Instagram has felt unprecedented. I don't have the data to back up to say whether or not it's unprecedented, but it certainly has felt unprecedented, where Palestinians on the ground in Sheikh Jarrah or in Haifa or in Gaza could not do Instagram live streams, could not post videos, had their accounts taken down. They were what is it called, shadow banned, which basically just means it's hard to, you can't access their stories. Yeah, exactly. And a lot of these were just people, just videos showing the police brutality, showing exactly what was happening. So social media censorship is a really big part of one of the ways to sort of clamp down on the growing Palestine movement, and just in general growing solidarity, especially as we've seen so many celebrities, people that have never spoken out, come out in support of Palestine, and not in like a hollow, we support Palestinian rights, but actually using words like ethnic cleansing, using words like apartheid. And of course, 3 weeks ago, was it just 3 weeks ago? I think it was just 3 weeks ago that Human Rights Watch released their 213-page report, formally accusing Israel or charging Israel with apartheid and persecution. And more than that, also talking about the corruption in the PLO. And I think most importantly, actually calling for sanctions, recommending to the United Nations that sanctions should be applied on Israel. And I think this is huge not because it's new. We've been saying it for decades. I mean, every Palestinian you ask will say, hey, we've been saying this for over 73 years. But because it gives us more, to fall back on, right? More evidence. The more we say this, the more people are saying this from different directions, the more likely we're going to be able to hold Israel accountable. So the left in the US, yes. I think that there's so much opportunity and potential right now, for a lot of the reasons Shireen laid out. There's an actual left in the United States right now, which there hadn't been for many decades. It's still small, but it exists and it's growing. And I think Democratic Socialists of America is a big part of that. It's around 90,000 right now and still growing. And the majority of those members joined in the last 2 to 3 years. And I think what that means is, we need to organize in our unions to divest from Israel, from Israeli bonds. Many of the largest unions in the US are still invested in Israeli bonds. I think we need to call for sanctions. I think we need to pressure the US to call for sanctions on Israel. And I don't think, if you had asked me 5 years ago, I would have honestly thought this to be like a very lofty dream that would happen decades down the line. But I think right now it seems very possible, very real, both because of the movements on the ground that are unified and that are calling for this, and because of the very rapid growth of the Palestine solidarity movement globally, but particularly in the US. I think in the US, it's actually different from all the other countries because of the importance of the US-Israel relationship, right? Like the US gives Israel, basically paid for the Iron Dome, first of all. It's Israel's single largest arms supplier. And it's constantly diverting any attempt to hold Israel accountable in the UN or any other body. So I think in the US, we have a very particular role to play. So sanctions. I think another thing is BDS, the B and the D part, the boycott and divestments on campuses, in workplaces, etc., is really, really key. And I think all of this plays into, how we influence policy directly. Because at the end of the day, it does make a difference when there's someone like AOC and Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar in Congress. Like, it makes a difference when you have those people saying what we want them to say. And they don't say it overnight. They say it after, a lot of conversations and pressure and people organizing on the ground. But it makes a very big difference. And the photo that came out, was it Friday or Saturday, of Rashida Tlaib confronting Joe Biden on the tarmac in Michigan. I mean, this is a US member of Congress confronting the president on the tarmac saying, stop supplying the arms that are killing my family. These are historic, I think, on so many levels. And I think it's important to point that out and think about how do we grow that and sort of make the most out of that. And then I think the other thing that I'll say is, in the US in particular, is really growing the anti-Zionist movement and thinking about how we use that terminology to build for what Palestinians are calling for. It's not just apartheid, it's ethnic cleansing. It's not just apartheid, it's settler colonialism, and calling for full decolonization, not just part. And really cutting back against the fragmentation, the abstract and geographic fragmentation that Israel is using to control Palestinians and entrench its project. I guess, I think there's a lot of potential for the left, but I think it's a question of how quickly can we organize to use this moment, because we're not going to have it for very much longer. We all know that it's usually when a ceasefire is called, things die down and go back to the status quo, which for Palestinians is just the everyday brutality of occupation. And so it's a question of how do we use this right now to really push for calls for sanction, for BDS, etc.
Yeah, I will just briefly say, so a number of things. You mentioned also the climate movement. I forgot to mention it before. I was happily surprised to see that the Fridays for Future coalition has basically put out a statement, essentially saying that they support Palestine against ethnic cleansing and all of that, which I was really happy to see. And they actually problematizes themselves, like even asking the question in advance, like, why is the climate group talking about Palestine? They attempted to answer it. And I think that that's a very important conversation to have, especially in the context of Israel's whole, myth of greening the desert and all of that. I think that's a really important thing. I'll definitely have an episode specifically on that. On the apartheid question, Human Rights Watch's report is, of course, very important. It followed, B'Tselem said that a few years ago, and other groups across the world have said this before. And of course, Palestinian groups have been saying it for a longer time. But Human Rights Watch saying it has, of course, its impact. Last Sunday, I spoke with a friend of mine who's Maya on this podcast, who is South African, and she's also Jewish. And she managed to, I think, elaborate in very specific ways how the comparison to apartheid, basically its limitations. So, yes, it is absolutely apartheid, but as you also said, Sumaya, it is also more than that. And there are very, all comparison, no comparison is ever perfect, of course. It is useful in as much as, given that there is the crime of apartheid and persecution, as Human Rights said, which is a very specific legal crime, then that is, something that can be campaigned on, essentially, which is very important. But there's also the next steps to be taken, which I think Palestinians are, of course, very well tuned to. And, Sumaya, you mentioned it right now. So I just wanted to add that as well. So, to kind of, we're winding down a bit, but I would like just maybe a few more thoughts on your sides in terms of, if there's anything I may have missed to tackle, or if there's anything you wanted to expand upon a bit more before we sort of wrap up to get into the, the book section of the episode.
Sure. So every time I'm having one of these conversations, after I speak, I'm like, wow, there's a million things that I forgot to say. And I think it's because, one, the richness of how Palestinians resist, and the myriad of ways that they do, and also the brutality of what Israel's doing, and the myriad of ways they creatively come up with methods of oppressing Palestinians. But I wanted to actually share, yesterday a 17-year-old Palestinian was shot and killed. He was shot and killed on the day of the strike on Tuesday. Sorry, he was shot on the day of the strike on Tuesday, and he succumbed to his wounds yesterday. He was 17 years old. His name is Muhammad Mahmoud Kiwan. And Palestinians in 48 organized a very large rally and demonstration and march for his funeral, which was today. And there were thousands of people at his funeral, and they all chanted in unison. And I actually want to read the chant. It's in Arabic, so I'll translate it. We were not born to live in degradation. We were born to live in freedom. And I think that is really emblematic of everything that Palestinians from the river to the sea, from Gaza to the West Bank, Jerusalem, in 48 and in the diaspora, that is the root of our struggle, is that we want to live free. We just want to live, right? We just don't want to live every day just trying to survive to the next, but actually want to live in freedom. And I think that's the call that people all over the world right now are demanding as they suffer from COVID, as they suffer from austerity, and from settler colonialism in a number of different places. So I wanted to share that. And I also want to share that, this goes back to the shift. So I apologize that I'm saying it now, but just a decade ago, or a little over a decade ago, you couldn't really say Palestine or Palestinians on mainstream news. It would be edited out, or it would have to come with some sort of qualification. And now we have Palestinians saying what they want to say in their own words in the mainstream. And I think that is really, really indicative of the shift that is happening. I also want to say that as exciting as it is inspiring, all of this is, at the same time, we're nowhere near where we need to be. Like there's so much that needs to be done. It's not going to be as simple as like in a year, there's a chance Palestine will be free. I think that we are in a new chapter, as the strike manifesto says. This is a new chapter that we're writing, and it's an important one. But it also really necessitates that everyone understand the urgency of this moment, the urgency of this potential, not just for Palestinian freedom, but actually for liberation across the region, in the Middle East and North Africa, and here in the United States. I mean, what it would mean to fully cut ties with Israel and the US, to uncover all of these arms deals, these surveillance deals and technology deals, that has huge ramifications on a number of struggles in the United States as well. And the US remains the most powerful imperial country in the world. So anything that happens here will have ripple effects around the world.
For sure. Just to add to what you just said, I mean, it wasn't that long ago that, Netanyahu went to Congress and got more standing ovations than even Obama did during his own, So it is pretty significant that I'm seeing people like Noura, like Mariam, like a number of other people on these media outlets. And I think Noura herself mentioned that she would actually be allowed to talk, and they would be like sympathetic, and it says a lot. I think that I think that our expectations have gotten so low, essentially, that even this is amazing. And I mean, not that it isn't significant in itself, but there is a bit of a bittersweet aspect to it as well. But yeah, just wanted to add that.
Can I add something real quick? So news was actually, apparently, a ceasefire has been agreed to for tomorrow morning between Hamas and Israel. And I think that a lot of that has to do with a number of things, but I think it's important to say that this resolution that was introduced by these members of Congress and Bernie, I think, have the effect of applying pressure on Israel. Because if something like this passes and gains traction, it sets a precedent for other arms deals not to go through. Other actions I'm sure you all heard about the ship in Italy, and then the one in the Bay Area where workers were trying to organize not to unload or load ships with arms going straight to Israel. So the hope is that despite this ceasefire, which of course is good, that momentum doesn't die down, and that the urgency of what is happening in Palestine continues, and that people don't only care when Gaza is being carpet bombed, but they also care when Gaza is under siege, when Palestinians are forced out of their homes, when the ethnic cleansing project continues, and it's in all the other ways.
And not to mention that, like, given that it's tomorrow morning, it might actually mean that tonight might also be very terrifying. So people should really not forget that as well.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for all that, Sumaya. I really agreed with what you said about, this is we're about to reach liberation. We still have so much work to do. I think what we're seeing right now, just to reiterate, the colonizer is getting more and more violent. It's the most brutal bombardment of Gaza, more brutal than 2009, 2012, 2014. It's hard to imagine the brutality keeps getting more intense. And we can expect, unfortunately, like, it's horrific, but we can expect more of that. So on the one hand, the colonizer is getting more violent, and on the other hand, our side is just starting to cohere, but with a higher expectation for what liberation is going to be. But on the other hand, we saw, as I think you mentioned, Sumaya, it's mostly protest in a youth-led effort in Sheikh Jarrah, and across cities inside 48 or Israel. It has been largely youth-led, and that's allowed, rejecting the concessions that the political parties have made, whether in the first Intifada, as I mentioned, or in many other instances, and saying, our vision of liberation is so much bigger than that. But still, there's so much work to be done just to cohere. And this is not just in Palestine, it's also here, it's also across the Middle East. Like, what is our side going to look like? How are we going to build towards power? We're just starting to see a left in the US and the DSA, and we're just starting to figure it out. Yes, we have, the DSA has been invaluable, of course. I'm glad you mentioned that, Sumaya. But we're still figuring out, what's our best route to actual changes on the ground and to actual power, which, again, I would say is keep building our movement, make it sustained, as you said, Sumaya. And our job as socialists, again, is just keep these connections going. I guess I wanted to mention, there weren't protests inside regime Syria, but there were protests in Idlib, which is what they call rebel-held or non-regime Syria. There were mass protests in solidarity. So paying attention to the regional aspect, which again is in a period of despair. We can't romanticize that. And there needs to be, we need to be in a much stronger position in the US, in Palestine, and globally to actually get to that liberation that we want to see. I wrote down 3 books, but this isn't one of them, but I just read or reread Freedom is a Constant Struggle, and I was reminded of that. It's talks and interviews with Angela Davis about Palestine and Black liberation, and just showing how deeply tied together they are. And
so just before we get into the book section, just very quickly, I'll say that in Beirut as well, there were protests yesterday for Palestine, and if I'm not mistaken, today as well, probably as we're recording or a bit earlier. And they meet like extreme pressure. The numbers are definitely smaller than they would otherwise. Of course, as you mentioned, Sumaya, a few days ago, there were the attempts to basically get to the border, which was stopped because it's a UN zone, especially, and the army stops people. Stops non-Lebanese specifically, I have to say. Lebanese people are technically allowed to pass. But anyway, so just to emphasize that even in the context of Lebanon, where like the state of Lebanon is technically in a state of war with Israel, and one would think, I mean, people who don't know the context would assume that maybe, the population is more sympathetic, or not population, that the political class is more sympathetic or not, but they're actually not, and they're just using it for their own purposes. I'm not going to get into the Hezbollah stuff for now. I rant about them elsewhere. But it's something that Palestinians in Lebanon definitely have to deal with significantly more. And I just wanted to emphasize that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think I'll just, one thing that I've really noticed, this is back to the shift. I'm new to Twitter. I joined Twitter in December, and I suddenly feel like it's a whole world that I've been missing out on, for good or for bad, I don't know. But I think what's increasingly become clear, at least in the US, with the last month in particular, is there's no longer a middle ground. You either support Palestinians and their demands for freedom, or you justify what Israel is doing. There's no yes to this and yes to this and but, or it's really those two, because there's the excuse of ignorance really falls flat. I mean, Palestine has been pushed to the mainstream in the last few weeks in the United States. You've heard about it one way or another, even if you don't know any of the details, you've heard about it. And so your choice to be silent is either a choice to be silent because you agree with what Israel is doing, and you just don't care. You don't care about Palestinians dying in the hundreds, or it's out of fear. And if it's the latter, I think hopefully you'll overcome that slowly because of how fast the movement is growing and how robust it is and how unapologetic it is in its demands. But I think that's where we are in the US. It really is, you're with the oppressor or you're with the oppressed. There's no middle ground to navigate.
Right. Yeah. I think, Mohammed al-Kurd, he's been one of the leaders in Sheikh Jarrah. He said very bluntly, you're either an unapologetic racist or you're with Palestinians. And I think that's a lesson. That's something that, that's the reason for me, Palestine is at the center of my politics. And that's why it's almost a guide to other struggles that you need to see as so connected. You're either with the oppressed or with the oppressor. It's that simple. It's that simple when it comes to Syria too. That's the framework that we need to use.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely. And, thanks for that. I think that's a really good note to kind of end ish on. But let's get to the book section. I always love this section. So what are 3 books that you two would recommend and why?
Okay. Obviously I said freedom is a constant struggle, but I wrote down 3 others. So Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, which describes how neoliberalism came into place through massive violence worldwide, partly led by the US. Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire by Deepa Kumar. I think it explains, so much of how things came to be today from a political, historical, and sort of political economy perspective, including the Arab states' relationships with, the Muslim Brotherhood, et cetera, and how these states in the US also saw Islamists as less of a threat than the progressive left. So they focused on crushing the left, but allowed Islamists to grow. Et cetera, et cetera. So it breaks through essentialism around Islam and the idea of the Muslim world, and it shows that phenomena today are, a product of imperialism and political choices. And then finally, A Woman in the Crossfire, Diaries of the Syrian Revolution by Samar Yazbeck, which is a little bit hard to find these days. It's her earlier book on her experiences in the revolution. So I love that book because it gives a real feel for, how things were at the very start of the Syrian revolution, including how Palestinians were smeared by the Assad regime, how the regime from the beginning tried to ramp up sectarianism to crush the uprising, and the efforts of students and young activists to carry forward despite everything.
So one of mine was one that Shireen listed, so I'm going to have to come up with another one. It was Islamophobia and the Politics of Empire. It's a really, really fabulous book, and I think anyone living in the United States in particular, I think should read this. This should be in one of the top 5 books you read in the next 7 months. So my first 2 are actually novels. So the first is called, I'm a big fan of historical novels. The first is Arundhati Roy's Ministry of Utmost Happiness.
Yeah.
It's a really, really fabulous, really rich book, and truly a historical novel. You will learn just as much as a nonfiction book. Very good book. And then the second is I'm very into spy novels and espionage. And John le Carré is someone who I discovered a few months ago. And started reading, and actually his books kept me company. I had COVID in January, and his books kept me company for 2 weeks. But one of my favorite books of his is called Smiley's People. Really highly recommend it if you want to just be taken to a different era. Fabulous writing, also very historical, very good book. And then I think instead of a third book, Joey, if this is okay, since mine was also Islamophobia plus Empire, I'm going to recommend a movie. That is really, it's probably one of my top 2 favorite movies. It's called Kafar Qasim. I don't think it's available anywhere right now, unfortunately, unless you find a bootleg copy because it's being restored. But it was made in the 1970s, and it's about the Kafar Qasim massacre in 1956. And the reason it's so powerful is because it starts on the eve of Nasser announcing the nationalization of the Suez Canal. And it's about Kafar Qasim, and it shows the different political groupings in Kafar Qasim, the sort of socioeconomic breakdown of the people in Kafar Qasim. So you had the Nasserists, you had the communists, You had the workers that worked for this Israeli settlement, and then the Palestinian middleman and the corrupt mayor. It's a really, really great movie, and highly recommend it if you haven't seen it yet.
It's by my PhD is on Lebanese cinema. It's by Burhan Alawieh from the 70s.
Sumaya, you also reminded me. I wanted to bring up the movie, The Feeling of Being Watched. Do you know that movie? It talks about it talks about how basically Islamophobic surveillance in the U.S., specifically talking about a community in Chicago, and how certain figures in the community were brought charges against them basically because of them raising money for Palestine. But in the end, all they could get against them was, leaving something out of their taxes. but it's using one example of a community in Chicago to say how Islamophobic surveillance works across the U.S. Really to put people under the label of terrorism for giving money to Palestine, and then going after them in all different basically it's the idea, the feeling of being watched. It's like the FBI is constantly watching you.
Yeah, it's 2018. I just found it. I will link everything we're talking about now in the show notes and on the blog post anyway. But yeah, I mean, guys, thanks a lot for this. This has been really informative. I will actually try my best to publish it soon after, like now, basically soon, in a few hours maybe. But yeah, thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Joey.
Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. If you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.